Well, good morning, y'all. As Greg said, we are in the middle of a series entitled The Story of God. And we're really studying how God has revealed himself throughout history and trying to better understand the character of God and what we can know about him and, quite frankly, what we can't know about him. And after going back and looking at my first message of this series and listening to Lance last week on the podcast from Nicaragua, I don't know about you, but I'm a little confused right now as to who God really is in this moment, because I feel like we find ourselves in a moment in history that's pretty chaotic, that it really feels like the whole thing has been uprooted and it's kind of like up in the air, and I don't know what to really think, but what I do know is that there is this chasm that has established itself since the fall that exists between God and man, and it feels like God's trying to resolve it, but I don't think we know exactly how he's going to do it yet. And then we go into this period of time from where Lance kind of left off to several hundred years where God goes dark. He's silent. Nobody's heard from him. And the descendants of Abraham that were, God's chosen, promised people had now become a conquered people. They were slaves to the Egyptians, and after a long series of events that changed his life, we find that Moses is now basically a shepherd out in the middle of Nowheresville, and he is somehow looking for something, but I'm not sure that he even knows what he's looking for. And then all of a sudden, there is this fire above, up on the mountain, that suddenly just flares up. And in Exodus chapter 3, starting with verse 1, and we're going to be in Exodus 3 most of the day today, he says, "Now Moses led the flock to the far side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. And Moses saw that even though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'm going to go over and see what this is all about, why this bush isn't burning up. So Moses realizes that this fire just keeps on burning and burning and burning, and it's not stopping, and we get the impression that the fire was big enough, even though it was up on the mountain, it was big enough, and Moses is curious enough that he decides that he's going to follow this fire up the mountainside and see what's going on. And when the Lord saw that Moses had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, and he says, "Moses, that'll freak you out." Moses says, "Here I am." And in this moment, we are about to see God reveal himself in a way that we've never known before. We are about to be introduced to the God who always was, who is, and who always will be with you. So, when I say the word God, what do you think of? What does that conjure up in your head? Better yet, when I say the word God and you say the word God, do you think we're thinking about the same thing? The same God? Who is the God that you believe in? Do you even know? As we've talked about many times, we live in a pluralistic society, which means that there are the beliefs and the ideas that exist in this country run the gamut. And if the polls state that 97.5% of Americans believe in God, you go, great. But what does that really mean? Because I'm going to promise you that not 97.5% of Americans believe in the God I know. Who is the God that everybody's believing in? And for you, when you cry out to God in your darkest moments of your life, who is it that you're trying to connect with? Several thousand years after Exodus, in the New Testament, existed the ancient city of Athens. And it was almost like the New York City of today. It too was a pluralistic society, and there existed many, many different religions. And the Apostle Paul finds himself in the city of Athens, and as for the first time, and as he walks around and observes what's going on, he sees that the city is just full of idols. There's an idol for everything imaginable. They had an idol that represented the god of the sun, one of the god of the earth. They had a god of the harvest and a goddess of fertility. You name it, they had a god for it. And just to make sure they had covered all their bases, they even had an idol with the inscription that read, "To an unknown God," just in case they forgot anybody. And so Paul realizes that while these were all very religious, spiritual people, they believed in the idea of God, but they really didn't know who he is. They were searching for God, but they didn't know how to find him or what that even looked like. And so Paul says, let me introduce you to the God that you've been looking for. Moses, several thousand years earlier, he was kind of in the same bucket. He's hiding out in the wilderness. He was a Hebrew who was raised in an Egyptian world that was full of idols, but he believed in this Hebrew God. He ended up killing a man to protect one of his Hebrew brethren, and the Pharaoh now was trying to kill him, and so he fled, and he goes out in the middle of nowhere and becomes a shepherd in hiding. And at his base, he believes in God. But he has no idea who God really is until this moment that he follows this fire up onto the mountain. And the God who was unknown to him at the time appears to him in the form of a burning bush. And as Moses approaches, God says, "Hey, don't come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." And then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." So right off the bat, God says, I know you don't know who I am, but let me introduce myself to you. I am, in the Hebrew text, Elohim, which you may remember from a couple weeks ago, we talked about this, that Elohim is the word that describes God as a deity. And so by way of introduction, Moses, God says, I am the Elohim of your father. I am the Elohim of Abraham and of Jacob, the all-powerful God of the people of Moses, of the line of Moses. And so he says, I am the God that you've been looking for all these years, and so now, take off your shoes. Out of respect. Because you're standing on holy ground. You're standing on the ground in the presence of the great Elohim. And in Exodus chapter 3, verse 6, it says, at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look upon God. So Moses somehow gets the idea that he knows in his heart, this is the real deal. This bush is talking to me. Something's going on. I'm not going to take it lightly. And somehow instinctively he knows that he can't even look upon God or he will die. And so in verse 7, the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. And so I've come down to rescue them. Isn't that interesting? After so long we haven't heard from God, he says he's come down to rescue them. So now, Moses, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? So I am sure that if you weren't raised in Sunday school, that you have at least seen the movie, and so I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of the life of Moses. I'm going to stick right here to the story of God throughout this whole thing. And so God says, with all due respect, Moses, it doesn't matter who you are. What matters is, I will be with you. In verse 12, that's what he said. And God said, I will be with you. Now, I am no linguist. And if you have been with me in Nicaragua when I've been trying to say my best Spanglish, you know it ain't pretty. I can maybe speak a little Irish over a Guinness, but that might be it. But we're going to go to the Hebrew for the rest of this time together, and I'm going to say things that probably aren't the correct pronunciation. Let's just get that straight, because the Hebrew language is a little more difficult and a little more breathy than I tend to get. But I want us to understand what's going on in the Hebrew, because the Old Testament was written, as we know, the New Testament was written in Greek, but the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. And so there are words and there are images that we can bring out from the Hebrew text that I think are really, really important. And so when God says in verse 12, I will be with you, he uses the word ayeh. I am with you and will always be with you, is what that word means. So in other words, God says, don't worry about it, Moses. I am with you and I will be with you when you go to Pharaoh. In fact, God says, this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. You see, he's standing there on Mount Horeb, which happens to be coincidentally the very place that when Moses leads the children out of Egypt and back to Mount Horeb, this is the very place that God will deliver the Ten Commandments into Moses' hands. But I find it interesting that God is still trying to define himself almost to Moses by prophesying that the God you will worship on this mountain, just to be very clear, the Elohim you will worship on this mountain when the Israelites are free is the same God you are talking to right now. Make no mistake about it. And you can tell that Moses is still trying to wrap his head around this whole thing. What's going on? And who is it that he's really talking to in this fire? And so Moses said to God, okay, God, let's just suppose that I go to the Israelites and I say to him, the God, the Elohim of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's your name? What should I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And this is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. In the Hebrew, that phrase is the same phrase that was translated earlier that says, I will be with you. It is still ayah. In this particular case, it is ayah, aser, ayah, which is I am who I am. Tell them I am who I am. I am who will always be with you is with you. And I am the one who has sent them to you. And so when God says, I am, what he is saying is he is the God who is and always will be with you. He is the beginning and the end and everything in the middle. I am. Now that's not his name, by the way. God still hasn't responded to Moses' question. What God just said is who he is. He still hasn't said his name yet. He wants to be very clear before he gives up his name. God wants to make sure that when it comes time to drop his name, that Moses understands the true power behind it. Have you ever thought about, if you ever wanted to change your name, what would it be? You ever think about that? What name would you take? Would you want a strong name, beautiful name, something a little more artistic? We all want our names to mean something, right? In this moment, I don't know, does it feel like God maybe gets caught flat-footed? Like, what is my name? And I believe what's going on here is that God is building a name for himself out of the elements of what he wants us to understand are the most important things that he wants us to know. He wants his name to mean something, which is that our God is the one true God who will always be with you. And so here it comes. God also said to Moses, here's what you're to say to the Israelites. Say the Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. The Lord, the Elohim of your fathers, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob, has sent me to you. Here it is. God drops his name right here. For the first time, God gives himself a name that means something. His name is Yahweh. Yahweh. If Elohim is a general description of God, like the word human describes us as a species, Yahweh is the proper name for God, like Darren is my name. God says, you want to know my name? It's Yahweh. 4,000 times in the Old Testament, Yahweh appears. And God's proper name, by the way, is always translated in our English Bibles as capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. Yahweh. And so every time we hear the word Yahweh, or we see Lord in all caps in our Bible, you should think this is the proper name for God, like John or Mike is a name. And so God goes on and he says, Yahweh, this is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Now let me just clarify something, because if you were here a couple weeks ago, you know that I brought out Yahweh out of the book of Genesis, and that's where it appears for the first time early on in Genesis. And if you believe in the tradition, as we do, that Moses is the author of the book of Genesis, then you understand that this is the true first encounter in history where God has revealed his name as being Yahweh. This is the first time that God has revealed this name to Moses, and Moses then retroactively puts it into the book of Genesis as he authors that book. This is the moment where God reveals himself and his name. Now, you don't have to be a linguist to understand the similarities between Ayeh and Yahweh. And it really feels like God, as he goes through this conversation with Moses, is building for himself a name upon the foundation of the word Ayeh, which is the word for I am, and will always be with you. Now, the interesting thing here is that there is this shift that occurs here, because when God refers to himself, he always refers to himself as Ayeh. I am with you. I am the God who will always be with you. But when asked, what is your name that you want people to call you, he says it's Yahweh, the God who will always be with you. And this plays out in a very, very real way for the Israelites when we skip forward to Moses after he has actually led them out of Egypt. We see Yahweh, who is literally and always with them. Exodus chapter 13, by day, the Lord, Yahweh, it says, went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way. And by night, a pillar of fire to give them light so that they could travel by day or by night, that they would always know where they're going if they're following. Neither the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of his people. Never, never did God leave his people. God began to be present in the lives of the people in the form of a pillar of cloud leading them by day and a pillar of fire leading them by night. And so the Israelites lived in this constant awareness that they were standing in the presence of God, because they could see evidence that he was in their midst all the time. He never, ever left their side. Elohim, the God of the universe, is no longer a mystery. He is now known as Yahweh. And now we also see a shift that begins to occur in the Bible, because God now begins to establish himself as the one and only God, as the Yahweh. And he begins to lay down the law, both figuratively and literally. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 5, we see that God and Moses find themselves back on Mount Horeb as God promised Moses would be. And the very first commandment, the very first one out the box, God begins to distinguish himself against all other Elohim. And in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 6, he says, I am the Lord, Yahweh, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Yahweh, your God, Elohim, who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery, in case you need a little reminder about who I am and what I've done for you, who is the God that is relevant in your life. And then he says, first commandment, you shall have no other gods, Elohim, small g, before me. He's talking about what we believe. Who is God in our life? What do we believe in? And Yahweh says, there can be no other God before me. There is no other Yahweh, because I am the creator and I am the sustainer of all things. You see, this is a very clear message for those of us who live in a pluralistic society thousands and thousands of years later. This is very relevant to what we deal with still today. That there is just this lostness that occurs about who God is when you say the word God. Who is that for you? Who are you referring to? I think we've just diluted this word God to the point that we have made it ambiguous, and it can mean anything you want it to mean. It can be any Elohim you want it to be. It's just this generic catch-all God. But what does it mean to you? Much like the situation that the Apostle Paul found himself in Athens when he sees the idol to an unknown God. Is God really known to you? Do you know the God you pray to as Elohim? A pretty generic God? Or do you know him as Yahweh? The God who is and always will be with you. I think just to be honest, I think we create excuses in our head about this. And I think that we all want to be perceived as politically correct. I think that we all want to be perceived as being open-minded. And so we throw out this generic God, and we say, we're all headed to the same place anyway, right? All roads eventually lead to heaven. We all believe in the same stuff at the end of the day. I have to be honest with you. Yahweh, he takes issue with that. He doesn't much like it. I think we can disagree with people about their beliefs and our beliefs without being a hater. And the reason why I think that I end up in so many incredibly complex conversations with people who are Hindu and atheists and Jewish and Muslim, who, by the way, are all very close friends of mine, is because I'm not out looking for a fight. I'm not out looking to be right. I understand that we live in a pluralistic society, and I understand that people can shake out on the other side and believe differently than me, and I respect that. But that doesn't mean that I have to back down from my faith. That doesn't mean that I have to dilute the word God. That doesn't mean that God doesn't want me to stand up for who I am and what I believe in the Yahweh that I know. Because as for me and my house, we will serve capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. In Acts chapter 17, as the Apostle Paul is still walking around Athens, he finds himself in front of the Areopagus, which is a kind of a think tank in the ancient world. And so he says, "For as I walked around, I looked carefully at your objects of worship. I found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God." And so it occurs to me, he said, that you don't even know the very thing you worship. And this is what I am going to make known to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord, the Yahweh of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. He is the one and only God who gives everyone life and breath and everything else. God did this so that mankind would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us, because he is the Ayah. Paul says, look, it is not enough to just be a spiritual person. It's not enough to just believe in God. Even the demons believe in God and shudder. It is not enough to believe in some generic Elohim. There will come a point when we have to give an account for our lives, and on that day we're going to stand before the one and only Elohim. And on that day, we will know beyond a shadow of a doubt that his name is Yahweh. Can we begin to change our worldview and get rid of the ambiguity and take ownership of our faith, and to see that every step that we take we are standing on holy ground. Because the God that we know is the God who is really everywhere. And we can no longer distinguish between the sacred and the secular, because every single day we live out our lives in the sacred presence of the I am. And he is really closer than you will ever know. A great philosopher and theologian was once asked in an interview, what is the greatest spiritual need in the lives of church people today? And he said this: to discover the true identity of God, he said. For if believers truly understood the personality and nature of God, it would revolutionize their lives. I have to tell you that rings true in my own life. There are times when my soul wages war on God and I don't even know why. There are times when I am complacent and I am lazy and I have moved Elohim onto the back burner and I don't even know why. But in those moments of clarity, when I truly understand the personality and nature of God, when I remember who Yahweh is, it changes everything for me. And that's why looking at how God has revealed himself throughout history to understand his character and who he is, why this is so important to what we believe in, it's foundational to our faith. And so just in case you were wondering, the unknown God that you have been crying out to in the darkest moments of your life is the great I am, the Ayah. And that time when you threw up a prayer out of desperation, you didn't even know who it was you were talking to. It was the I am who heard your prayer and who stayed by your side. When you stood there and you watched that sunset and you felt something deeper than you ever have before and you knew there was something more, you felt Yahweh. When we leave this earth, there will not be some generic God that will be there to greet us. Standing there before us in that moment will be Yahweh, the God who was, the God who is, and the God who always will be with you. Because it is only He that always will be.